My name is Nicholas Danforth, and this is the War on the Rocks podcast, covering strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. I'm here today, once again, with Mike Kaufman to give us the latest on the war in Ukraine. Mike, good to be back here.
Yeah, thanks for hosting again.
So tell us what's been happening on the three fronts.
All right, so I think this is a bit of a catch-up. If we look around what were the three main axes of advance, and including a fourth, which was the Russian counterattack up north, if we start with the last bit first, the Russian counterattack at Crimea, that situation, I think, predictably stabilized. Ukrainian forces themselves wasn't able to counterattack and substantially reduce the salient that the Russian forces had tried to create. And in many respects, I think probably stabilize the situation, at least for now. Although it's still developing, I think Russian military is going to keep trying to push there and try to get an opportunity that at least they sense while the Ukrainian military is focused on the summer offensive. If we look around the Ukrainian offensive operations, what I think we'll find is in Orikhiv pushing down towards Tokmak, we've had several series of Ukrainian forces try to push through east of Robotne and actually take at least now kind of the northeast edge of the town. Probably by the time this podcast comes out, right now we're recording this on a Friday afternoon in downtown DC, but Ukrainian forces may ultimately press the Russian military out of Robotne in the coming days and weeks. That said, there hasn't been a dramatically changed dynamic in the fight on that axis, and Ukrainian forces are still largely just at the Russian main line of defense there. Although, as I've come to understand, I think there's probably a bit of a terminological difference, the way we in the United States describe the lines of defense and the way Ukrainians describe the line of defense, where the security zone, that is this initial line of defense, where much of the fight has been, I think Ukrainian officials tend to treat that as the first main Russian line of defense, whereas we tend to look at the three defensive belts, which are kind of these large lines of dragon's teeth, minefields, large anti-tank ditches, and these three defensive belts that are running a bit further south as the main lines, and then the area where much of the fighting has been as the initial defenses are more as a security zone. Sorry, it's a bit of a nuanced difference, but I've come to realize where sometimes Ukrainian officials announce that they're through the first line of defense and fighting in the intervening zone for the second, and we say, well, on the map, it doesn't look like they're through the first line of defense. It looks like they're kind of just outside of it in some places or have just reached it, that it may be a disagreement in how we're classifying these things. So if we look at the axis of advance from Vyika and Novosilka, that looks like it's heading towards Berdyansk. I think Ukrainian forces somewhat expectedly were able to advance because in the past several weeks, they pushed south from Makarivka to Staromayorsk, and the town that's right across from it is named Urozhaina. And it was pretty clear that the Russian military was going to have to withdraw from that town, otherwise face steady encirclement. And finally, they were pressed out in recent days. They withdrew. So that's going to reset this battle a bit further south. And the main line of defense runs just at or south of Staromilnivka, which is a larger town not far away from those. But the challenge with this axis is, even though Ukrainian military has had some steady success, it's very clearly a secondary axis. And the reason for that is the bulk of the second echelon forces and the additional reserves have already been thrown in at Orikhiv, pushing south around Robotne, or some call Robotine, or as some in U.S. officialdom just call Robo. Folks have asked me in the past, sometimes, why do I pronounce some of these town names in a way different than the way you might pronounce them in Ukrainian or Russian? And the answer for that is straightforward. A whole host of my colleagues pronounce these towns in the way someone would in the United States, just reading the English name on Google Maps. And knowing the exact pronunciation of itself isn't easy, but most importantly, the point of this podcast is to convey information, not to convey, the exact precise way how to pronounce, Wagner versus Wagner. With that in mind, the main axis still remains, and very clearly is the push from Orikhiv. And I think now we're kind of past the point where Ukraine has committed the second echelon forces, which are elements of the 10th Corps going in. The 10th Corps seemed to involve the 116th, 17th, and 18th brigades, along with National Guard brigades, the 3rd and 14th. And we've now seen both sides commit reserves. The Ukrainian military has committed reserves from, I think, 46th and 82nd Air Mobile Brigades. 82nd was the U.S.-equipped Stryker and Martyr Infantry Fighting Vehicle Brigade. And the Russian military has also committed its reserves from the 7th Guards Air Assault Division and other units they had in the Dnieper grouping of forces. So this is, at the end of the day, a contest of wills. It's going to come down to who has the most combat power remaining, who has the most reserves remaining. And it's probably going to drag out based on the types of units both sides are using. And essentially, the reason I say that is it's going to be clear that either the Russian military, which itself is looking a bit bedraggled and exhausted, either it will be worn down, Ukrainian military will run low on combat power and ammunition, but it's going to be much clearer in the coming weeks. That said, I think I've been on the record on this over the past several podcasts that seeing second echelon forces go in, seeing de-pick munitions used over the past several weeks, I've seen Ukrainian forces make gains, steady gains, against the Russian military, but the overall dynamic of the offensive hasn't changed.
So let's take a step back and talk about that a little bit. Tell us about the overall dynamic of the offensive. Have there been notable shifts in strategy that stand out?
Tactically speaking, it's fluctuated between phases of extensive artillery preparation, basically degrading Russian fires and Russian counter battery, both radars and actual units assigned to counter battery fire, and steady advances by units, by infantry at about the size of, let's say, platoon and a half sized elements, with attempts at attacks, typically at the size of reinforced company or company tactical groups, basically mechanized attacks with armored support. And the offensive has gone back and forth between these types of fights. But in general, it's stayed relatively small-scale fighting, focused fairly narrowly on a couple points. Like much of the fighting on our Rehab axis, not all of it, has been just west of Verbove and at Robotyne, at this very particular point that very clearly looks like a breaching point that Ukrainian military is attempting to make. And the same can be said with a lot of the fighting on the Velika Novosilka axis. The Bakhmut axis I didn't really cover. Their Ukrainian forces have made steady progress, but actually I'm a bit surprised. I thought at this point they probably have captured the southern town of Klishivka, but there still seems to be fighting for it. And, I can't remember, maybe in a podcast a few weeks ago, I might have jumped the gun essentially saying that it looked like they were going to get it. Although I still think they will. I think it's just a matter of time. But in that axis, they've been steadily advancing in the flanks, but it's a supporting axis, and that's a very important point to understand. I mean, that offensive in and of itself does not have a key strategic objective that it's going to. It's meant to draw and fix Russian forces there. But the dynamic overall has been that, as Russian forces get worn down, they try to rotate troops, try to bring in reinforcements to plug their holes. Ukraine has been steadily feeding more and more brigades into the fight. At this point, I think every single brigade allocated to this offensive, or almost every single brigade, has contributed, has been involved in the fight. So just to clear the air on a particular argument where, folks imagine that there's some whole other set of brigades, some other set aside of combat power out there, the answer is probably not. I think Ukrainian military still has a considerable amount of combat power on the books, but there are a lot of caveats that come with that. And the same thing goes for the Russian side of the story. The Russian military has been defending forward. They built a defense in depth, but interestingly, they chose not to employ it. They chose to deploy forward and to conduct an active defense and to counterattack the Ukrainian military when they took positions, tree lines, towns. And in that regard, they fed a whole bunch of themselves, let's say, into the fight. But nonetheless, the Russian defense is echelon, meaning they rotate battalions amongst the regiments that are defending the line. They have reserves. They have territorial troops that are basically set up behind these main lines. But they chose not to retreat and, let's say, trade terrain for attrition, but rather take the matchup in the initial line of defense, or sort of the crumple zone of the Russian defenses, which I found interesting. To some extent, I think it's stereotypical of Russian overconfidence, and so they chose to take on risk. And that's why some folks believe that, okay, if Ukraine is able to wear those forces down, then there isn't much beyond them. I don't think that's really true. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think Russia's probably defending with the overall minimum amount of forces they can have in this area. And the reason they're doing that is they're probably pretty confident that they have it, and that they could, let's say they could retreat from Rabotna tomorrow, they could pull back and hold the next set of towns along the main line. But as always, they could be totally wrong. They could also be taking on a huge amount of unnecessary risk. So with regards to your question of strategy, it's a really good one. The Russian strategy had been to actively defend, not to use a lot of the lines that they had set up, essentially withdrawing, but actually to fight and counterattack. Not the way they did around Bakhmut, let's say, but at least launch one or two counterattacks before giving up a set of positions and lines. Probably fair to say it's been about the same in Bakhmut. They've chosen to deploy a lot of forces to the flanks of Bakhmut, which had been to Ukraine's advantage because that fight plays more to Ukraine's favor. And they threw a lot of airborne into the fire Bakhmut and let them get attrition there, which suggests that for one reason or another, that area is also important to them. On the Ukrainian side, it's actually an interesting conversation. Let's get into it a bit because, there's been a lot of debates and there's been a number of articles coming out. I've been traveling lately, but...
Well, that's why I assume you've read them, even if you just got back. I did want to ask you about both the New York Times, the Washington Post have had reporting that's obviously garnered a lot of interest. Would be eager to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I have caught up and I have seen the articles that came out today. I'm not quite sure what to make of some of them, but I'll do my best. And I tend not to comment too much on what folks in the journalist occupation put out, but let's talk the specifics. So there's a Washington Post article, I think, today talking about new U.S. intelligence estimate and some U.S. qualms or complaints, criticisms, let's say. My view of it is that, first, it is fair that a lot of folks and analysts looking at the current situation with the offensive have probably become fairly pessimistic about how it's gone and its prospects for attaining the sort of strategic aims of either getting to the coast, the Sea of Azov, or to cities like Melitopol or Berdyansk. I think that's fair. Folks like me have been saying that probably for the past several weeks, not months. That doesn't mean that this offensive can't still make significant progress overall or along some of the axis. A lot can change in the span of just a few weeks, but I think it's clear based on what's been happening the past several months that folks have gotten more pessimistic.
Hi everybody, Aaron Stein here. Just wanted to take a quick break from Nick and Mike's conversation to remind listeners that Mike has another podcast, a members-only show called The Russia Contingency, which you can gain access to by signing up at www.warontherocks.com/membership, where Mike himself hosts a series of in-depth conversations about the war in Ukraine, Russian and Soviet history, and everything in between. You'll also gain access to Nick's newsletter, Mid-Afternoon Map, and a slew of other podcasts that I host along with Ryan. With that, back to the show.
Some of the criticisms I've read that came out recently in these articles I find to be unfair, or more accurately, representative of general misunderstanding. And that is, and by the way, the articles, the New York Times article and the Washington Post article together almost create an analytical input-output problem, not to be a nerd about this.
Mention the New York Times article for folks, too.
So there's a New York Times article essentially discussing losses on both sides, and it's just the Ukrainian losses have been quite high, higher than previously estimated. Russian losses are also high, more than Ukrainian ones. And it sort of digs into some of the reasons why losses increased dramatically over the course of the winter and spring. I think it fairly brings up the question of Bakhmut and the extensive amount of attrition both sides suffered fighting over Bakhmut. But it essentially suggests that Ukrainians had much higher loss. Although looking at the data there, I have to be very honest, the ratio of killed to wounded in action and total casualties, to me, the structure of the numbers there don't make a lot of sense. And they look very different from the previous series of numbers that the United States had been releasing or disclosing. Let's put it one way or another. So I don't know what to make of the numbers, meaning the structure of the numbers, the way they come together, doesn't make sense to me, either for Russia or Ukraine. And that's not to challenge the credibility of the numbers being put out there, but maybe just to put a fair caveat on the fact that it sounds like we may not have the best estimates on this, or that these estimates may not be very high confidence. And in general, while the numbers in those articles are ranges, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that they're actual ranges, because one thing that always drives me crazy is sort of a number being given of casualties without any confidence levels assigned to it and without the estimate range, because these are always estimated, and U.S. seems to kind of have the lower part of the range be 80% of the higher part of the range, although it can vary.
So now reading them both together.
Yeah, so reading them both together, it leads you to think, because first, the New York Times piece suggests that the Ukrainian casualties are high. The Washington Post piece has some courageous anonymous U.S. officials making statements that the Ukrainian military, they feel, was being timid and trying to avoid casualties, right? That they actually were pursuing the offensive in a way that was being conservative, not massing their forces, and trying to minimize their casualties. So New York Times says the casualties have been very high, and Washington Post says Ukrainians have been fighting in a way to avoid their casualties. And that's fine, because as an analyst, that creates an input-output problem, and that forces me to have to think about it and try to put these stories together. What I think, at least to me, not the truth, but the best possible interpretation, is that probably the Ukrainian military did have significant casualties over the course of winter and spring, and certainly during the offensive. The side that is on the offensive is the one that typically takes more casualties, right? It's harder to attack than to defend, particularly in the land domain, and you expect the attacking side to take fairly high casualties. Although Ukraine has done pretty well on the balance of attrition, as best as one can observe from open sources in this particular fight. I think that the claim that the Ukrainian military is being overly conservative in the approach probably isn't fair. I think this has generally been a misunderstanding. And the main challenge is that I think folks in the U.S. interpret what they are seeing as a function of choice and preferences in kind of Ukrainian strategy or approach. Whereas in practice, here's what I think is going on. First, the Ukrainian military just fundamentally has constraints and limitations on the extent to which it can scale the employment of forces on the offense. And I've talked about this several times, which is that military on the offense typically generates reinforced companies in the attack, and coordinating even that level of action isn't easy. Okay, so first, U.S. military expectations, let's say, and not so U.S. military, but U.S. expectations in general, that Ukraine is going to dramatically change the way it fights, and especially with new brigades that have had 3 months of training, are profoundly unrealistic. It's profoundly unrealistic, and the issue I see is less in how Ukraine is necessarily prosecuting the fight, and more in the fact that I'm not sure our people really understand the Ukrainian military and how it fights. One of the biggest reasons for that is that we're not there. Like, we do not have the requisite touch points across the Ukrainian military to have an effective feedback mechanism. This is my own personal interpretation. I'm not stating this as a matter of fact. And the reason I say this is because I see a fair amount of misunderstanding as to how Ukrainian forces operate. Secondarily, in order to mass forces, Ukraine probably would not only have to have the capacity to employ force at that scale and to coordinate action at that scale, which as a force, I think institutionally, that's very much a work in progress for them. But they would also have to have the enablers and the supporting capabilities at that level provided by the West. I'm not sure they do. And the level of Russian defense as it's been prepared and laid out makes it exceedingly difficult. And so I think it's quite logical the Ukrainian military decided that this kind of action wasn't going to be successful, and more importantly, that the offensive would have to alternate between attritional phases and trying to press the Russian military with dismounted infantry attacks, and then seeing if the conditions were set for smaller scale mechanized assaults, right, which they have attempted multiple times in this offensive, and then going back to dismounted infantry, and then again going back to limited mechanized attacks, right, by, let's say, reinforced company or several reinforced companies, depending on the front. So I feel like a lot of the criticism that I've heard in this regard just isn't fair, and it stems from an interpretation of why the Ukrainian military is fighting the way it is, rather from a clear understanding. The criticisms that I think are also a bit, at least lead me to some skepticism, is on mass versus distribution of forces. I think that it's important to understand that every military strategy comes with trade-offs and risks. And the Ukrainian strategy initially was to try to press the Russian military on 3 axes, develop a main one, see if they could force the Russian military to shift forces over to other axes and fix their reserves there, and then create opportunities for breakthrough and exploit them. The trade-off in that strategy is that it would have to inherently diffuse the Ukrainian attack along 3 axes and the supporting fires. And so the superiority in any one axis would be probably relative rather than decisive. And also the trade-off obviously would be is that the Russian forces might be strong enough to hold the Ukrainian military along those 3 axes and prevent a significant breakthrough on any one of them, and then lead to a sort of slugfest. All right, now what about the fair criticisms? The ones that at least seem fair to me. The two that I think probably stand out, and we're probably some months or some amount of time out from having any real sense of where the truth lies. It's a lot easier to tell the story of an offensive after it's happened, right? You're dealing with very imperfect information. Is first that if you look at the distribution of forces, Ukraine's best brigades, most experienced units are fighting around Bakhmut. And the newer brigades, the ones that did not show themselves as well as effectively, the ones with a fairly short amount of training, they're the ones primarily on the main axes, supported by more experienced units and some National Guard brigades. And so if you look at the distribution, not in the number of brigades, but effective combat strength based on experience of these units, their quality, what have you, it definitely raises some question mark between the units allocated to what is the supporting axis of advance or supporting effort and the ones allocated to what the main effort is. And also the overall concentration, too, between these axes. And the second one could be about planning iteration, basically adaptation of the overall military strategy to what happened in the early days, which is it is perfectly accepted that plans really survive first contact with the enemy, and the enemy gets a big vote in what's going to happen, right? And you can always overestimate or underestimate their level of preparation. There's a lot of assumptions, and you figure out which assumptions went wrong early on. But you could also ask, to what extent have we seen a significant adjustment in the Ukrainian plan and how they prosecuted the offensive after the initial breaching attempt wasn't successful? And I'm not sure that over the last, 2 months or more than 2 months, we've seen very significant changes. But this is all up to debate. The last point I'll make on this is, why are these articles coming out? Why are we seeing this?
Right. That seems like the interesting thing.
Yeah. So to me, at least, it first sounds like folks are already positioning themselves for a potential blame game to play out over the offensive. They say defeat is an orphan, but that's not true, actually, right? In reality, people often try to assign defeat to one side or another, and there's often a lot of coalition wrangling between allies and partners and what have you. So I think part of it's, of course, people trying to cover for themselves to some extent and saying, hey, the intelligence community didn't think that this was necessarily going to be successful. That one's straightforward too, as I've said before, and I've said on this podcast and other podcasts that, in DC, the adage rings true that something's either a policy success or it's an intelligence failure. So I'm never surprised when I see a leak come out that says actually the intelligence community knew it and was on top of something. The other part of it's, definitely I think folks are trying to point fingers at problems that they think they they have observed in the Ukrainian approach, just as there's been a fairly robust conversation over recent months about why the offensive hasn't succeeded because we didn't provide the equipment on time,
Right.
we didn't provide the right amount of equipment, we didn't give F-16s, so I'm not sure how we could have done that without getting into a time machine that takes us several years back. I mean, to actually have a viable capability to employ that platform at some scale and be able to support it, I mean, the soonest that's going to happen is next year, but it's not going to translate to air superiority or the kind of effects people associate with. We had that conversation, I think, 2 podcasts back. But in general, if you wanted to be on that path, you probably should have started before this war began. Well before this war began. So with all that in mind, I think the honest answer is that, yes, it's a combination of both. This is first and foremost Ukraine's war, and they make all the choices. And the United States doesn't get to dictate to Ukraine how it plays out. And the essence of sort of the military strategy and what goes into it is very much Ukraine's. That said, it is also very much shaped by Western support or lack thereof, or when it is untimely, or we don't provide certain capabilities, and the hand-wringing that's involved in getting capabilities to Ukraine. And so we have to be honest about the fact that we also structure Ukraine's choices, and that the two are fundamentally interrelated. And I think that whenever there was success, both sides were keen to take credit, and we would see Washington Post and New York Times articles coming out with U.S. officials saying, well, we war gamed all this, and we were involved in the planning and this, that, and other. And whenever you don't see success, in an ideal universe, I would love to see both sides, and it's actually more than both sides. I would love to see United States. I would love to see Europeans, for example, take ownership of how long it took them to begin serious investments into defense industrial production and why we ended up having to borrow artillery ammo from South Korea and then providing cluster munitions just to extend the timeline for this offensive. I think that would be a great conversation to see emerge. But just even beyond that, it would be much better to see all sides take ownership of what's taking place in the war.
One final question for you before we got to wrap up this afternoon. Tell us what's happening in the Black Sea.
Been sort of negligent in discussing what happened since the breakdown of the Black Sea grain deal and sort of the 2 deals, the one having to do with grain exports and ammonia export, and then the fairly successful attacks by Ukrainian forces by drones, one by USVs against a Russian Reputia-class LST coming out of Novorossiysk, which was a pretty long-range attack for Ukrainian forces to be able to conduct. The way it sort of developed is, after the deal broke down, I won't get into the details of the deal. I think it's been discussed extensively. The quick story in that is Russia essentially made a whole bunch of additional demands, and those demands wouldn't be met. They pulled out of the deal. The deal was structured as being renewed every several months. What happened after that is Russia basically made a statement that it would consider ships going to Ukraine as potentially carrying military cargo, which is sort of like a veiled blockade in being. It's de facto an insurance blockade without being an active blockade. And here we're getting to technicalities. Because to have an active blockade, you have to enforce it. To enforce the blockade, you have to have ships out there. Right? And you have to have ships physically stopping other ships or boarding them. And for a while, the Russian military didn't do this. Now, part of the reason for that is obvious. The Russian military is not in a position to conduct a close-in blockade because they would have to face Ukrainian anti-ship missiles and the various capabilities Ukraine has. So the blockade appeared to be largely an insurance blockade. Instead, they went after Ukrainian export infrastructure, started striking the ports on the Danube River and also Odessa. And this essentially would limit Ukraine's ability to export without the Russian Navy necessarily having to go out to do a blockade, and also make the risk to the ships going there much higher. But a bunch of ships went to the Danube ports anyway, not to Odessa, but to the ones on the river. Okay, the Ukrainian military retaliated and struck a Russian ship, support transit ship that's sort of part of the resupply chain for its forces in Syria, and then more spectacularly, a Russian LST coming out of Novorossiysk And this, of course, threatened the Russian Navy. We already knew for a long time that the Russian Navy was at threat if it was going to be operating in the Black Sea, and it looks like Ukrainian capabilities are getting better and better. They've also been conducting strikes in Crimea against Russian logistics with Storm Shadow missiles. They've conducted various strikes with modified versions of S-200, using it as a surface-to-surface missile. And they've struck the Kerch Strait Bridge as well. They struck it with drones underneath with USVs and tried a repeat attack, most recently with S-200s. The Russian Navy then actually did board one ship to kind of try to look like they're enforcing a blockade, right? I think to give this blockade some oomph, because the blockade looked like it was being challenged, essentially. Ships were just going to the Danube ports, not to Odessa, but nonetheless. And I think they were trying to make it look like they were then going to enforce a blockade, but they don't really have the capacity to set up a blockade. They could push for an outer blockade and have a string of ships there. So maybe I'm wrong. I'll pull that back. They could, but it would come at some risk, right? It would come at some risk. Last point on this. The challenge the Russian military has is that, let's put it this way, unrestricted warfare is kind of frowned upon, yeah? The sort of thing that Germany eventually pursued in...
But so, to be fair, a lot of other things Russia's doing right now.
Well, sure, but there are real consequences to unrestricted warfare. First of all, it can bring other parties into the conflict,
right?
Okay, when you destroy their ships and kill their citizens, okay, that's a problem. Second, unrestricted warfare can bring about all sorts of negative policy consequences for you in the international arena, and it's the sort of thing that is viewed as something that takes place rarely or relatively in isolation in modern conflicts, right? I mean, you can see an example maybe in the tanker wars during the Iran-Iraq War.
But even that came at a cost for internationalizing the conflict.
Absolutely. And so the challenge with unrestricted warfare is if your objective is to limit escalation in this conflict, right? And to manage escalation to prevent the involvement of other parties. Because if you engage in unrestricted warfare, then you could be making a case for a more robust NATO role in suddenly intervening to defend convoys, or at least certainly people will make that case, and I've read a number of people making that case. I'm not saying necessarily it's itself without very significant risk, but nonetheless, you are now creating the space for greater international involvement in the conflict itself. And so I think the Russian military and Russian leadership is a bit stuck. They probably want to coerce Ukraine into a deal. They want to do it with strikes. They want to have a blockade in being by primarily affecting insurance availability and prices for ships. They're probably going to try to do it by occasionally making some attempts at enforcing a blockade without really putting themselves at significant risk, because Ukraine has significant capabilities to challenge the Russian blockade or to make it very costly to maintain. And the best way the Russian military can answer that is to engage in unrestricted warfare. Now there, of course, just from Crimea alone, they can just destroy various cargo ships off the Ukrainian coast. They don't even need to have the Navy out necessarily to hit them with anti-ship missiles or with aviation or with submarines. Or if they wanted to, there's another option where they could just mine. They could just mine access to Ukrainian ports. So there's a whole variations of this. But this also takes them down a risky path that I don't think they necessarily want to travel. So it's a bit of a long explanation, but one thing that you find is there are a lot of nuances to the question of a blockade, enforcing a blockade, and there's a whole host of international laws that apply as well to blockades, to declaring them, to actually managing a blockade and how you have to interact with commercial ships that belong to other countries. And I'm not an expert on this, just to be clear, but there's a great deal of complexity to it than just declaring a blockade and calling it good. And there's quite a few steps between that and engaging in unrestricted naval warfare and just destroying whatever ships you feel like in the Black Sea.
Mike, thank you once again for joining us. Listeners, thank you for joining us as well. And of course, as always, if you're interested in hearing more of Mike's analysis about the situation in Ukraine, become a member of War on the Rocks. www.warontherocks.com/membership. And you'll also get my map blog, a number of warcasts, and other podcasts as well. So thank you all once again.